What if the stranger you mocked for who he loved was the one who risked everything to protect you? How would your world shatter, knowing your cruel words were aimed at the silent hero who kept your family alive all those years ago? And what if that single moment of truth forced you to confront not just your past, but the person you were always meant to become? Oscar slammed the car door harder than necessary, the echo bouncing off the trees lining Maple Grove Park. The late afternoon sun painted everything gold, but he barely noticed. At 19, he carried the kind of swagger that came from being the star quarterback at Lincoln High and the only son of a man who still bragged about his own glory days in the Marines. Today was supposed to be simple: grab a burger with the guys, laugh about nothing, and head home before his dad started asking why his grades were slipping again. Instead, his eyes landed on the older man sitting alone on the bench near the flagpole. Elias. Everyone in town knew the name, even if they pretended not to. Silver at the temples, posture straight as if the uniform still hung on his shoulders, and that quiet way of watching the world like he'd already seen too much of it. Oscar had heard the rumors for years. The guy was gay, lived alone on the edge of town, kept to himself after 20 years in the service. To Oscar, that made him an easy target. "Look at that," Oscar muttered to his buddy Tyler, loud enough for half the park to hear. "Old man thinks he can just sit there like he belongs." Probably spent more time dodging bullets than dodging the truth about himself. The words tasted sharp on his tongue, and the laughter that followed from Tyler felt like victory. Elias didn't flinch. He simply turned the page of the book in his lap, the corners of his mouth lifting in a small, unreadable smile. Oscar's chest tightened with something he couldn't name: irritation, maybe, or the sudden need to push harder. By the time they left, Oscar was already replaying the scene in his head, convinced he'd won some invisible battle. He didn't see Elias close the book and stare after the retreating car, eyes shadowed with a memory that went back more than a decade. That night, over dinner, Oscar's father clapped him on the back. "Heard you gave that fairy a piece of your mind today. Good for you, son. World's gone soft." Oscar grinned, but the food tasted like ash. The next morning, Oscar woke to his mother's voice downstairs, strained and hushed. "The insurance papers came again, Mark. We can't keep pretending the accident never happened." Oscar froze on the stairs. Accident? He had vague flashes, sirens, smoke, his mother screaming his name when he was 9, but his parents had always shut the conversation down. Now the words drifted up like smoke. "If it weren't for that man, we wouldn't be here." He shook it off, grabbed his keys, and headed to school. But the seed was planted. By afternoon practice, his throws were off. Coach pulled him aside. "Head in the game, Reynolds." Oscar nodded, but his mind kept drifting back to the park bench and the man who hadn't even looked up when the insults flew. That evening, Elias stood in his small kitchen, reheating leftover stew. The scar on his left arm itched, the one from the night he dragged a burning car door open on a rain-slick highway outside town. He'd been on leave, driving home from the base, when the SUV flipped. 3 people inside: a terrified woman, a little boy clutching a stuffed bear, and a man bleeding from the head. Elias had pulled them out before the fuel caught. The family never learned his name. He'd slipped away once the paramedics arrived. He never regretted it. Some things you did because they were right, not because anyone would thank you. Across town, Oscar stared at his bedroom ceiling, the mocking words he'd thrown so carelessly now echoing back at him. He didn't know why the memory wouldn't leave him alone. He just knew something inside him had started to crack. The crack widened the following Saturday when Oscar's mother finally broke. She found him in the garage, pretending to tune his truck, and handed him a faded newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local Hero Pulls Family from Wreckage." The photo was blurry, but the man in the torn fatigues was unmistakable. Elias. Oscar's hands shook as he read the date. 10 years ago, almost to the day. "You were 9, his mother said softly. "Your father was driving too fast after an argument. The car rolled. We would have burned alive if that soldier hadn't stopped. He carried you out first, Oscar. You were unconscious. He refused the medal, refused interviews. Said he was just doing his job." Oscar felt the floor tilt. All those years of his father's casual slurs, the jokes at dinner, the way he'd been raised to believe certain kinds of men were weak, and the one man who'd saved them was exactly the kind his father hated most. The arrogance that had felt like armor suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. He drove to the park without thinking. Elias was there again, this time feeding ducks by the pond. Oscar stopped 10 feet away, words jammed in his throat. I didn't know. Elias turned, calm gray eyes meeting Oscar's stormy blue ones. Didn't expect you to, kid. Most people forget. The conversation that followed was halting, awkward. Elias spoke of his years in Afghanistan, the friends he'd lost, the quiet decision to stop hiding who he was once the bullets stopped flying. Oscar listened, really listened, for the first time. Something about Elias's voice, steady, without bitterness, chipped away at the wall Oscar had built. By the time the sun dipped low, Oscar had admitted he didn't know why he'd mocked him. Elias simply nodded. We all carry things we're afraid to look at. That night Oscar lay awake again, but this time the questions were different. Why did his chest feel tight every time he remembered Elias's quiet smile? Why did the thought of his father's approval suddenly feel hollow? He texted Tyler a lame excuse and skipped the usual weekend party. Instead, he sat on his roof, staring at the stars, wondering when the boy who'd thrown insults had started disappearing. Monday brought the first real test. At school, Tyler cornered him in the locker room. Dude, you going soft? I heard you were talking to that queer vet yesterday. Oscar's fist clenched, but instead of the usual laugh, he felt nausea rise. Leave it alone, he muttered. Tyler's eyes narrowed. Your dad hear about this, you're done. The words landed like a punch. Oscar drove straight to Elias's modest house on the outskirts, a place he'd once driven past just to sneer. He knocked, heart hammering. Elias opened the door, surprised but not unwelcoming. Over coffee that tasted like regret, Oscar spilled everything. The family secret, the mocking, the way his father's voice now made him flinch. Elias listened without judgment, then shared his own story, the partner he'd lost in the service, the letters he still kept, the decision to live openly even when the town whispered. For the first time, Oscar heard the word gay spoken without venom. He left that afternoon carrying a book Elias had pressed into his hands, a memoir about soldiers who came home different. That night he read until his eyes burned. The pages described fear, love, courage, things he'd always thought belonged only to straight heroes. His mother noticed the change first. You seem quieter, she said at breakfast. Oscar almost told her everything, but the fear of his father's reaction sealed his lips. Instead, he started running. Early mornings past Elias's street, waving when he saw the older man on the porch. Small gestures, but each one felt like stepping toward something real. The misunderstanding hit, like a freight train 2 weeks later. Tyler, still angry about Oscar's distance, spread a rumor that Oscar had been hanging out with the fag vet. The words reached Oscar's father at the barber shop. That evening the house exploded. You think I raised you to be like him? His father roared. Oscar stood his ground for the first time. He saved our lives, Dad. You never even thanked him. The slap came fast. Oscar tasted blood, but the real wound was deeper. The look in his father's eyes that said he'd rather lose a son than accept the truth. Oscar stormed out and drove to Elias's in the pouring rain. When Elias opened the door, Oscar broke. I don't know who I am anymore. Elias pulled him inside, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, and made hot chocolate like he was still 9 years old. They talked until dawn, about fear, about the courage it took to stand alone, about how love didn't make a man weak. Oscar fell asleep on the couch, the first peaceful sleep he'd had in weeks. When he woke, Elias was reading in the armchair, the morning light softening every line on his face. Oscar realized with a jolt that the tightness in his chest wasn't fear anymore. It was something warmer, something he wasn't ready to name but couldn't ignore. The crisis peaked at the town's annual Veterans Day ceremony. Oscar's father had insisted the family attend, a public show of patriotism. Elias was scheduled to speak, quietly, reluctantly, about service and coming home. Oscar sat in the third row, heart pounding as his father's glare burned into his back. When Elias stepped to the podium, the crowd murmured. Oscar's father muttered loud enough for half the row to hear. Shouldn't let his kind speak. Oscar stood. The words poured out before he could stop them. That man pulled me from a burning car when I was 9. He saved Mom and Dad too. If that's the kind of man we're ashamed of, then I don't want any part of this town's shame. Gasps rippled. His father's face went purple. Elias met Oscar's eyes across the crowd, a small nod of gratitude that felt like absolution. Afterward, the confrontation in the parking lot was brutal. His father disowned him on the spot. "You're no son of mine if you defend that lifestyle." Oscar's mother cried, but didn't intervene. Tyler turned his back. Alone on the curb, Oscar finally understood the cost of truth. Elias found him there, offered a ride home, not to Oscar's house, but to the small guest room above his garage. "Stay as long as you need," he said simply. That night, Oscar cried for the boy he'd been and the man he was becoming. Elias sat beside him, silent strength, never pushing, just present. Spring arrived with new leaves and quieter mornings. Oscar had enrolled in community college, working part-time at the hardware store Elias owned. The town still whispered, but the whispers lost their sting. His mother started visiting on Sundays, bringing casseroles and cautious hugs. His father remained silent, but Oscar stopped waiting for approval. One evening on the porch, Elias handed him a letter, the one he'd written but never sent 10 years ago, addressed to the unknown family he'd saved. Oscar read it aloud, voice thick. "I don't need thanks. I just hope the boy grows up knowing kindness doesn't have a uniform." Oscar looked at Elias, really looked, and saw the man who had risked everything twice. Once on a highway, once by opening his home. "I think I'm ready to say thank you," Oscar whispered. "For everything." Elias smiled, the kind that reached his eyes. "You already did, kid. Every day you choose to be better." They sat in comfortable silence as fireflies danced. Oscar finally understood the questions that had haunted him months ago. The stranger he'd mocked had become the friend who saved him again, this time from himself. In the end, the journey wasn't about erasing the past. It was about carrying it differently. Oscar still carried the scar of his father's rejection, but he also carried the quiet strength of a man who had loved and lost and kept going. And somewhere between the mocking words and the grateful ones, he found the courage to love himself exactly as he was. This story reminds us that the people we judge most harshly often carry the light we need most. The real lesson is simple. Pause before you speak, because every human heart holds a history you cannot see. My advice: choose curiosity over cruelty. It just might save your own life in ways you never expected.